Well, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's talk, Where People Power Meets Peacebuilding by Dr. Maria Stephan. My name is John Keys and I direct Loyola's Office of Peace and Justice. This is the second event in our annual Bunting Peace and Justice Speaker Series, which brings leaders, scholars, and activists to Loyola to address issues of timely relevance at the intersection of peace and justice. Last month, we were delighted to host Ray Kelly on the topic of policing and racial justice in Baltimore. And we look forward to welcoming Arsalan Suleiman November 10th for a talk entitled Litigating Genocide at the International Court of Justice. That talk, like all of our talks this semester, will be virtual, so look out for registration details in the coming weeks. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Office of Equity and Inclusion and the Messina Program, for their assistance in organizing today's event. I also want to thank Mary Catherine Bunting, whose generous gift established our program and makes the work we do possible. Now, it is a tremendous honor to welcome to Loyola Dr. Maria Stephan. Dr. Stephan is widely recognized as one of the world's leading experts on social movements, nonviolence, and civil resistance. A graduate of Boston College and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, she has promoted nonviolent action in many capacities, including as lead foreign affairs officer for the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the US State Department. She is perhaps best known as the co-author of Why Civil Resistance Works, a groundbreaking book that examines over 300 cases of resistance from around the world and argues for the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance over other violent methods. The book received widespread acclaim and many awards, including the prestigious Woodrow Wilson Foundation Prize by the American Political Science Association and the Louisville Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Dr. Stephan's work has appeared in many venues, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and NPR. She is no stranger to Jesuit institutions, having been a past keynote speaker at the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice, a place that's very beloved to our Loyola students here. Consulted around the world for her insights into what ordinary people can do when they concert their energies for justice. Few are better positioned than Dr. Stephan to guide us as we think about the challenges and possibilities of our current moment. Her talk is entitled Where People Power Meets Peacebuilding. After her remarks, there will be some time for Q&A. I have some questions that students have submitted in advance, and I'll ask some of those on their behalf. There's also a comment box that you can enter questions into as we go, so please feel free to use that. Now, join me in welcoming Dr. Maria Stephan.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John, for that kind introduction. I was honored to be invited by the Peace and Justice Studies program to be part of the Bunting Speaker Series. It's a pleasure to speak with all of you, Loyola students and faculty, and the broader Baltimore community at this extraordinary and extraordinarily challenging time in the United States and around the world. As John mentioned, by way of introduction, I did attend another Jesuit school, Boston College, for my undergrad many years ago, almost a quarter century ago. But I was telling John before, I don't quite recall anything like Loyola Palooza, which I understand is a proud Greyhound tradition. And so I'm hoping that you all will be able to take that online this year, notwithstanding the pandemic. I am very grateful for the power of a Jesuit education to encourage critical thinking along with the Jesuit commitment to serving others, which Mary Catherine Bunting's life has certainly epitomized. And, you know, Loyola's motto, which I read, "Strong truths well lived," could not be more prophetic at a time when truth and decency are under attack in this country. So we're having this conversation today in the midst of a pandemic that has killed over 210,000 Americans in the wake of nationwide protests for racial justice following the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many other Black men and women in this country. And we're 26 days out from a highly consequential election in this country where nothing less than democracy is on the ballot. So all this context informs my remarks today, where I'll be speaking about people power and peace building and why I think we need both in powerful combination to transform conflict in this country and globally. So I'll ask Scott and Jason to start the slideshow. Awesome, thanks guys. So I'm first going to speak to some of the research that I've done on nonviolent civil resistance and its track record around the world. I'll then talk about why I think the creative synergy between nonviolent action and peace building is key to solving the many complex challenges that we face as a country and as a global community. I'll conclude by reflecting on the nexus of people power and peace building in the context of the struggle for racial justice and the upcoming election. But first, let me tell you a brief story about how I came into this work. While most of my professional career has focused on international conflict, I actually grew up in rural Vermont, where I'm speaking to you from today. My parents, Marianne and Phil, were very committed to social justice and were very actively involved in restorative justice work with former prisoners and college students, which I was involved in as well. I began reading books about Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, Dolores Huerta, Oscar Romero, and other nonviolent heroes at a young age. After finishing up at Boston College, I attended graduate school. And during my first year of graduate studies, I attended the Boston launch of a new documentary film called A Force More Powerful. Slide, please. This Emmy-nominated film told the stories of 6 nonviolent struggles that had changed the course of history. The Gandhi-led independence movement in India, the Danish resistance to Nazi occupation, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, the Polish solidarity movement, the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins during the US civil rights movement, and the democracy movement in Chile that ousted dictator Augusto Pinochet. In each of these cases, unarmed civilians confronted brutal dictators and oppressors with strikes, boycotts, sit-ins, marches, civil disobedience, and countless other acts of nonviolent defiance. And they prevailed against huge odds. So that filled me with a lot of questions. How was it possible for genocidal dictators, military occupiers, and violent apartheid regimes to be defeated without violence? I wanted to better understand the strategies and tactics that ordinary people could use to challenge repression and succeed, which became the focus of my doctoral dissertation. A few years later, when I was working at an organization called the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict in Washington, D.C., I met Erica Chenoweth, a fellow political scientist and expert on political violence and domestic terrorism, who is now a professor at Harvard. We met at a workshop, and being a scholar and a practitioner of, or scholar of political violence, Erica was quite skeptical about the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance compared to armed struggle, particularly in the face of brutal opponents. At that time, this was about a decade ago, the prevailing wisdom was that, well, maybe nonviolent action could work in certain places, like in democratic contexts, but it can't possibly work against violent and repressive regimes. Or, you know, it can be used to achieve certain goals like political rights, women's rights, and the like, but it can't be used to achieve major political goals like removing dictatorships or ending military occupations. There was also this notion that terrorism or the use of political violence might not always work, but it certainly must work better than nonviolence. But the reality was that nobody had ever systematically tested these claims before, and no one had compared the effectiveness of violent and nonviolent resistance. So Erica and I decided to do exactly that. And we spent the next few years collecting data on 323 major violent and nonviolent campaigns from 1900 to 2006. These were campaigns with major political goals, like challenging authoritarian regimes or vying for territorial self-determination. I should note that while we were working on the research project and writing the book, I was working on this project from Kabul, Afghanistan, where I was serving in the State Department at the US Embassy. So in the middle of the war zone, we were having back and forth drafts about civil resistance and nonviolent struggles around the world. Anyway, a slide, please. The main finding from that study, described in our book, Why Civil Resistance Works, was that the nonviolent campaigns had succeeded twice as often as the armed insurgencies. The nonviolent campaigns succeeded 53% of the time compared to 26% of the time for violent campaigns. We found that nonviolent resistance was often successful regardless of the environmental conditions that people might associate with the failure of nonviolent campaigns, like high levels of repression and low levels of economic development. While nonviolent resistance did not always succeed, it failed. In the cases where violent resistance succeeded, which was about 25% of the time, in these cases, think Vietnam, Algeria, China, where insurgency succeeded, these societies almost always became dictatorships and often fell back into civil war. Slide, please. We were also interested in the longer term effects of violent and nonviolent campaigns on societies. We found that nonviolent campaigns were strong drivers of democratization. In fact, a vast majority of successful democratic transitions have been driven by bottom-up people power, which makes sense. The skills associated with successful nonviolent campaigns, dialogue, building coalitions, negotiating differences, are also key to running a democracy. Slide, please. It was also the case that nonviolent campaigns were far more likely to result in long-term societal peace compared to armed resistance, which was far more likely to be followed by civil war. Slide, please. It's worth noting, I didn't include the graph on the prevalence of nonviolent campaigns, but it's worth noting that there's been a huge uptick in the number of nonviolent campaigns around the world, particularly over the last decade. There were more protests around the world in 2019 than at any other time in recorded history. Last year, you may all recall the nonviolent uprisings that removed a long-standing military dictator in Sudan and in Algeria. In Hong Kong, you might recall the creative youth-led protests that challenged Chinese government repression. And of course, there's been an explosion of protests in the United States that we'll return to a bit later. Slide, please. So why has civil resistance so dramatically outperformed armed struggle? Next slide. We found that the most important variable in determining the outcome of the campaign was the size and the diversity of participation, which is where nonviolent campaigns had a distinct advantage. Nonviolent campaigns that relied on tactics like strikes, boycotts, vigils, demonstrations, and the like attracted on average 11 times the level of participants as the average violent campaign. Slide, please. Whereas armed insurgencies often rely on a relatively small group of young, able-bodied men, nonviolent campaigns attract women and men, youth and elderly, able-bodied and disabled, rich and poor. I would ask you to think about the recent protests that you've been a part of, whether Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives, protests over climate change, and think about the types of people and the diversity of people that you saw participating alongside you. Next slide, please. So why is participation so key to the success of resistance campaigns? Well, it's because all power holders, whether democratic or authoritarian, ultimately depend on the consent and the cooperation of ordinary people to stay in power. Regimes are held up by organizations and institutions called pillars of support. Think businesses, police, security forces, bureaucracies, religious institutions, schools and universities. And these pillars are made up of ordinary people like you and me who provide the skills, knowledge, labor, and material resources that they need to remain in control. When large groups of people from within these pillars remove their consent and cooperation from a regime, for example, workers go on strike, students and teachers stage walkouts, bureaucrats intentionally slow down paperwork, consumers boycott certain companies, etc., no ruler, no matter how brutal or repressive, can stay in power. The roof on the house erodes or even collapses. So the main point here is that power is given through consent and cooperation, and power can be taken away. Another finding from the research is that the chance of, and next slide please. Another finding from the research is that the chance of success, of campaign success, is higher when groups maintain nonviolent discipline in the face of violent repression, which is sadly almost unavoidable. This is a really key point that is especially relevant today in the United States, where protesters have faced both police and right-wing militias. Maintaining nonviolence in the face of violence is incredibly difficult, especially in tense moments when emotions are running high. And I'm sure some of you on this call can attest to this. At the same time, nonviolent discipline is strategically critical. Why? Well, it's important to remember that these struggles are ultimately contests for legitimacy. The goal is actually winning over the middle, the center. The more people you have participating from key pillars of support, the more power you have as a movement. Repressive regimes want protesters to use violence. They try to foment it, and they've tried in many cases around the world because that's how they win. Rather, drawing a stark contrast between protester actions and violence committed by police and militias is key to winning legitimacy and popular support. It's also more likely to make the opponent's use of violence backfire, resulting in a loss of popular support for that actor or perpetrator of violence. Violence used by protesters, even when used in self-defense, tends to muddy the water, discourages participation, and even leads to greater repression. This is the reason why many successful movements have publicly committed themselves to nonviolent discipline, have trained people in strategic nonviolence, and have deployed marshals to keep people safe. And according to research that my colleague Erica Chenoweth has done, women's active participation in nonviolent movements has been found actually to be key to promoting nonviolent discipline and is very strongly correlated with campaign success. So women's active involvement tends to increase the chances of success. So we also found in this research that campaigns were more likely to succeed when they adopted a sequenced and wide range of nonviolent tactics, meaning that they moved beyond street protests, rallies, and demonstrations and used dispersed acts of non-cooperation like stay-at-homes, strikes, boycotts, go-slow tactics, which are powerful and also very hard to repress. Think recently about how powerful it was when all the major professional sports leagues went on a labor strike following the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha. So while activists tend to focus a lot on street protests, those can be easily repressed, and they're not even necessarily where the power lies in nonviolent resistance. Being able to sequence a range of different tactics, so think going from petitions to silent vigils and sit-ins to more organized non-cooperation like strikes and boycotts, help movements to gradually build power, attract participation, and increase pressure, and that's key to success. We also found in the research that members of security forces like Army and police are significantly more likely to defect or to disobey regime orders to use repression versus protesters when they're confronted with large numbers of nonviolent resistors compared to when they're facing armed insurgents. Whereas violence gives them an excuse to crack down, nonviolence makes them think, oh my God, my wife, my daughter, my priest could be in the crowd. Do I really want to obey orders to fire back? And when security forces defect and take the side of the people, as they did in the Philippines during the People Power Revolution in 1986, or in Serbia in 2000, or in Tunisia in 2011, this is often decisive. So till now, I've talked a lot about civil resistance and the research that I've done on that. But if there's one thing I've grown to deeply appreciate, it's that people power and peace building are really two sides of the same coin. And that coin is conflict transformation. The late writer and activist Barbara Deming, in her essay, Revolution and Equilibrium, wrote about the two hands of nonviolence. One hand raised up says no to oppression and injustice, that's nonviolent resistance. One hand, the other hand, is extended and remains outstretched, saying yes to the humanity of the other, and that's peace building. Deming understood that you need both no and yes together to achieve peace backed by justice. Slide, please. Also, who understood this was the great Martin Luther King Jr. In his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, which King wrote from prison at a time when he was being widely criticized for advocating civil disobedience in the civil rights movement, he got to the heart of the relationship between people power and peace building. He wrote, "You may well ask, why direct action? Why the sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to so dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored." Now, let's think about that for a moment. For King, there was a need for both conflict escalation to raise awareness about issues, to disrupt the status quo, and to shift power. And there was a need for conflict de-escalation in order to build understanding, develop relationships, and help channel resistance into institutional change. For King, dialogue and direct action were inextricably linked and part of the same approach to positive structural change. At the heart of dialogue is active listening and honest but respectful speaking. Its goal is to improve understanding and relationships between people. Dialogue skills are key to resolving disputes that may arise between different factions of a movement or between different personalities, and they're key to building powerful coalitions, which we know is critical to movement success. Movements succeed, after all, when they welcome people who may have been opposed to the movement's aims at the beginning, which, let's be honest, is most people. And that is why peace building is so critical to the success of nonviolent action, and why nonviolent action is critical to leveling the playing field and shifting power to the point where you can have meaningful dialogue and negotiation that results in legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Slide, please. So how do you know when to protest, when to strike, when and how to negotiate? I would just flag here that the U.S. Institute of Peace has developed a really nifty resource called the Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peacebuilding Action Guide, or SNAP, which was co-written by Nadine Block and Lisa Schurch. And the guide is really designed to help activists and peace builders think strategically about how to combine nonviolent direct action tactics in peace building tools, skills, and approaches. The guide, which you can freely download online, and there's also an online course that you can take also for free. The guide is loaded with case studies, practical exercises, and planning tools. And so for sure, I'd encourage folks to check it out. Slide, please. And now in the really hyper-polarized context that we find ourselves today in the United States, which is exacerbated by social media, which tends to create silos and echo chambers, there are important dialogue initiatives underway, like Braver Angels and Sustained Dialogues, shown here. And these initiatives are encouraging community and campus-based dialogues in order to bridge divides. Their goal is to help people understand where those from the other side are coming from, the values that motivate them, and where there might be common ground. On a very personal note, I've learned the importance of dialogue work while deep canvassing in Northern Virginia the past few years with an organization called SURGE. Deep canvassing involves white folks initiating meaningful conversations with other white folks about racism and white supremacy. There's no lecturing, debating, or arguing. Rather, deep canvassing, which has been shown empirically to be quite effective, emphasizes sharing personal stories and experiences. It's grounded in the idea that emotional connections are what change beliefs and motivate people to take action. People change when they are uncomfortable, but not when they are humiliated. Dialogue that helps create discomfort in a constructive, non-belittling way can help move that process along. And I believe that is critical to dismantling racism and white supremacy in the United States. So, which brings us to the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for racial justice in this country. The nationwide protests last summer following George Floyd's brutal murder at the hand of Minneapolis police, which reached thousands of cities and towns, including conservative parts of the country, were the broadest and most persistent protests in United States history. The broadest and most persistent protest in United States history. And despite all of the hoopla about riots and looting, in fact, over 93% of the protests were nonviolent. The mostly peaceful and hugely participatory nature of the protests, which included kids, grandmothers, farmers, professionals, the like, helps to explain the dramatic shift in public opinion about police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement in their aftermath. These protests were not simply spontaneous acts of outrage. Rather, they were built on decades of Black-led organizing and coalition building, dialogue and direct action. The movement for Black Lives, created in 2013 following the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, has been organizing at the local and community level for years. Its 2016 Vision for Black Lives policy platform provided strategic focus for the movement. The mass BLM protests really, I can say, forced a national conversation, exactly as King would suggest that it would, notably amongst white folks, about their role in perpetuating racism and propping up an unjust system, starting with slavery and continuing with Jim Crow, redlining, police brutality, and mass incarceration. In his great book, which I'm sure many of you have read, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi talks about the importance of politics and policies to achieving racial equality and ending white supremacy. Dialogue and understanding are an important part of that. So too is collective action. Centering the voices and the experiences of Black and Brown people on campuses and in communities, truly listening to them, then challenging and changing institutional practices that are exclusionary, undermining the pillars of support that hold up systemic racism in our education system, in pop culture, in the criminal justice system, etc., is critical to advancing racial justice in America. I think the powerful combination of dialogue to build understanding and forge coalitions and direct action to disrupt the status quo and shift power is at the heart of that. where people power meets peace building. I think another area where we're going to need a powerful synergy of nonviolent action and peace building is to prevent violence and uphold our democracy in the upcoming election. Many experts and community leaders have been warning about the potential for violence, citing a number of risk factors, including widening social and economic inequality, persistent violence against racial minorities, a surge of inflammatory political rhetoric, the rise of paramilitary groups, and the polarization of political parties along mainly racial or religious lines, which are quite worrisome in the lead up to the election. Meanwhile, the president is actively seeking to undermine confidence in the election and casting doubt on the integrity of the democratic process. He has attacked mail-in ballots and refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. In other words, he is behaving like any wannabe autocrat. And for anyone familiar with the authoritarian playbook, the president's attempt to cast doubt on the election, suppress votes, and insist that only fraud will prevent him from winning are all too predictable. Fortunately, there is a proven strategy for countering autocratic attempts to steal elections and usurp power illegally. The first part of that is voting in mass numbers. And the second part is sustaining civic pressure to protect the results, including through organized mass action. This was how ordinary people in Serbia, Ukraine, the Gambia defended their democracies when the presidents tried to steal elections after they lost the vote. A similar approach may be needed here in the United States, and this is where everyone on this call can play a critical role. What we do individually and collectively over the next few weeks and months will determine the outcome of the election and, without exaggeration, help ensure that this country is able to continue on a democratic path. In practical terms, the most important thing one can do is vote and remind all of your friends and your family to vote. You can go to vote.org for anything you need to know about voting in person or via mail-in or absentee ballot. You can also volunteer to be a poll worker or poll monitor, which are greatly needed during this time of COVID. So check out powertothepolls.org. Slide, please. Another thing you can do is get together with some friends and form a local election protection group. My good friend and civil resistance expert, Hardy Merriman, co-wrote Hold the Line, a guide to defending democracy, which I highly commend to you. The guide lays out actions that ordinary people can take from now until election day to ensure a peaceful election. It gives an overview of potential scenarios that could play out between election day and inauguration day on January 20th. It shows how to set up an election protection group in your community. And the final part of the guide draws insights from nonviolent civil resistance movements in other parts of the world, drawing on research that I discussed earlier, and applies these lessons to the current context in the United States. So definitely check that out. Hold the Line has also just launched a campaign called Commitment to Uphold Democracy, whose goal is to get written public commitments from elected officials, police, and military leaders to uphold the integrity and the results of the 2020 election. It's a step-by-step approach to ensuring public accountability from our elected officials and to get police and military leaders to commit to adhering to the Constitution and protecting peaceful protesters. I am a proud signatory of this campaign and encourage everyone to take a look and join if you feel called. Another group, Choose Democracy, is inviting people to take a pledge to vote and then to prepare to undertake mass nonviolent action to protect the results in the event of a coup or executive power grab. Choose Democracy is also offering virtual trainings in how to prevent an executive power grab through organized civil resistance and mass non-cooperation. Groups are also responding to prevent and mitigate election-related violence and violence targeting vulnerable groups. Slide, please. Even though the current US administration has called anarchists and far left groups the most dangerous threats to the country, in fact, domestic intelligence agencies consider far right and white supremacist groups, groups tacitly supported by the president, to be the most significant terror threat to the United States. Violence and hate crimes committed by far-right groups has increased significantly. So anticipating and preparing responses to violence by vigilante groups and possibly by police while maintaining nonviolent discipline for the strategic reasons that we discussed earlier will be critically important to keeping the peace and defending democracy. Organizations like the National Council for Community Mediation, which oversees hundreds of community mediation centers across the country, and the Bridging Divides Initiative, which is tracking potential hotspots around the country, are helping to promote community resilience and violence prevention efforts. I think community groups like these, along with faith-based groups and religious leaders and women, of course, are going to play a key role in ensuring a peaceful democratic process. And one final practical note. Many organizations are now offering virtual workshops and trainings in nonviolent direct action and violence de-escalation. There's actually a really cool spreadsheet listing some of these trainings, which I'll add to the chat afterwards. And so I would encourage folks to take advantage of them. So in conclusion, and before we turn to Q&A, let me just offer 3 very brief reflections. First, the American people will determine the outcome of the election. So please vote and be prepared to hold elected officials accountable to ensuring that every vote is counted. Second, please take care of yourselves and each other. This is really a marathon, not a sprint. I would say that one of the most astounding developments under COVID has been the proliferation of mutual aid networks and local self-organizing around the country. And I think these networks are going to be so key to ensuring resilience and solidarity in the weeks and months ahead. So third and finally, as important as the upcoming election is, we know that people power and peace building must continue well beyond the election. The struggles for racial equality, environmental justice, gender and LGBTQ rights, economic equality, and transforming our democracy will require focus, persistence, and commitment, not to mention a creative combination of people power and peace building. So thank you all for all that you're doing to work for peace with justice in your communities. And with that, why don't we turn to a discussion? Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Stephan, on behalf of everyone listening, thank you so much for this inspiring talk. You've not only educated us by helping us see cases that have happened in the past, but you've given us a powerful call to action. You've helped us appreciate the synergy between people power and peace building. You've helped us connect it to current movements around Black lives, as well as to the challenges associated with the election. You've helped us look abroad to see that there are struggles there that can be applied here. And you've really given us a sense of a call to action, that this is a time that is asking for responsibility for all of us. And we thank you so much for that. We are challenged and we will meet that call to action. Thank you for also providing the specific strategies that we can all adopt. And we'll make sure that those resources get out to our viewers. Thank you, Dr. Stephan, for some of the time here now for Q&A. And as I mentioned at the outset, I have some students who've submitted some questions ahead of time. And then we also have the Q&A feature here in the chat. So please use that and we can get your question out. So the first couple of questions build on some of the themes that you mentioned around the connection between people power, peace building, and the protests this summer. One question was just trying to get at the effectiveness of different methods, something that you thought so hard about. And so this question was asking, you know, there were many protests this summer, both violent and nonviolent, that led to talk of police reform, ridding of Confederate statues, banning the Confederate flag, etc. Would you credit these successes solely to the nonviolent protests, or would you consider the violent ones as well playing some role in these accomplishments and steps toward reform?
Sure, that's a great question. And you know, this is a really common point of discussion and debate amongst activists and movements in this country and frankly around the world, whether adding elements of violence can actually increase the overall effectiveness of the movements. And I would just say to that, there's been some very good research on this question. My colleague Erica Chenoweth and Kurt Schock tested the idea of whether mixing violent and nonviolent tactics has helped movements historically. And the main finding from their research, they looked at a number of different cases from around the world. And their main finding was that a movement can win if there are, even in cases where there are elements of violence like Molotov cocktails, some forms of violent street clashes, that a movement can succeed in these cases if they're large enough and if the participation is already great enough to be able to essentially overcome the effects of using violence. So it can work. But the downside and the main finding of their research was that adding elements of violence tends to decrease overall participation in the movement. And participation is really key to success. And so while on the one hand, you may win a street fight or two, there may be some tactical values to using violence and the like. If you look strategically, the use of violence tends to minimize participation, and it also tends to bring on more violence. So even further disproportionate violence coming from the state or non-state violent actors. And so that's why, we, conclude that there is a strategic logic to nonviolent discipline. So in terms of the protests that happened, over the summer, I think it's really, and this relates to one of the questions asked by David in the chat as well. So these two questions link, and it's about kind of what drives change and how would we characterize most of the protests that happened in the United States this past summer and even into now. And here I think it's really, really important to note that the vast, vast, vast majority of the protests that happened this past summer, and frankly, since 2016, the last election, have been nonviolent. And that's based on data that ACLED has collected over at Princeton, the US Crisis Monitoring Report. And I would say that in the 93% of peaceful protests, the 7% that they classified as violent included property destruction, vandalism, and the like, which, many other researchers would not, for coding purposes, classify as violent. And so if you take those out, then one could say that the actual percentage of nonviolent protests is something like 95 or 97%. So I think it's really important to put that into context, because I think the shift that occurred and the conversations and the pressure on police departments related to defunding, and this was because of mass participation and participation from people in communities that normally didn't protest before. And so I think, while you can get away with using violence in certain cases, I think that the strategic power comes from mass and diverse participation. And that's hard to do when you're emphasizing kind of responding to sadly, inevitable violence with violence. So yes, I think that the nonviolent nature of the protests have been strongly correlated with the shifts in movement on different policy initiatives.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you also for mentioning David's question, who is getting at that shift that sometimes we see, from protest to the issue of rioting and looting, and you'd alluded to that too. Just to expand on that, I mean, what would you say in terms of when the media shifts attention to that? Do you have advice for how to stay focused when that may actually be misleading and directing attention away from the facts on the ground?
That's a really good question. I'm actually just wrapping up an article on the topic of protest law and order, which the outlet Just Security, I think, will be publishing sometime next week. And it's exactly on this question of how to kind of reframe the debate and almost turn the law and order argument a bit on its head. And I think the starting point for that is, yes, know that the vast majority of protests have been nonviolent, and the violent protests have tended to be committed by opportunists as opposed to people like strongly linked to the movement. So it tends to be the rioting, the looting, the vandalism is not only a minute portion of the protest, but it tends to be more committed by those who are acting from more opportunistic points of view. So that's point number one. Point number two, we often think that, well, most of the violence that we hear talked about is coming from protesters, that it's riots and like, you know, communities are at risk and police are at risk. What we know from data that Erica and others have been collecting is that, in fact, most of the brutal violence is not coming from protesters, it's coming from police. And in about 1% of the protests that we've seen have police been attacked by protesters, about 1%. And so I think it's really, whereas there's many documented instances of violence targeting protesters. That's point number two. Third and final point, there's a lot of talk about this almost existential threat posed by anarchists and left-wing groups, Antifa and the like. And I think it's really important to put that into perspective as well. As I mentioned in my remarks, it's actually the proliferation of far-right vigilante groups that are responsible for the most lawlessness, disorder, chaos, and violence in this country. So if it's about law and order, look to the groups that are actually most responsible for committing lawlessness, chaos, violence, and the like. And it's actually far-right groups that unfortunately are being supported by the administration. So those are three ways I would start to think about, you know, shifting the debate. But this is not to excuse violence by those on the left and others. It's just to say there's a bigger strategic play here, and this is where the nonviolent discipline part comes in.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, David, for that question. And for those listening, feel free to put some more questions into that chat. I have one question from a student who's read your book, Why Civil Resistance Works, and noted how we can measure the effectiveness of civil resistance abroad. Staying with the kind of case here in America and racial justice, what would you say are the things to look for when we see measures of the effectiveness of resistance? You've mentioned changes in law, changes in you know, viewpoints in different populations. How do we know when civil resistance is effective, and what should be some of the goals that we should be looking for in terms of the fruit of the resistance?
Yes, that's another great question. I mean, I think first and foremost, looking at participation levels, are people actually taking action on behalf of a cause or movement? And this is where the data being collected by Crowd Counting Consortium, which somebody maybe can put the link in the chat. So Crowd Counting Consortium has been measuring protests around a variety of issues over the past few years. So I think you can look to see, is there an increase in the size of participation? Is there an increase in the diversity of participation? So that's just from a protest perspective. I do think that public opinion matters a lot. So looking at polling about how do people perceive police brutality as a serious problem in this country, that like those survey results changed pretty significantly in the kind of pre-BLM protests to right after. So I think public opinion on key issues, and you know, I mentioned the deep canvassing approach. So the organization that is really specialized in this approach of deep dialogue and conversations is called Leadership Lab in California. And Leadership Lab found that these door-to-door conversations and the protests that were happening around gay rights and gay marriage, for example, helped to change public opinion in a very fast and remarkably fast manner. And so I think you can just look to kind of the shifts that occur on key issues. And then of course to the practical nuts and bolts, you know, policy changes and regulations changes, whether it's at the local level, having to do with, you know, local police practices, funding, whether it's at the national level with kind of key legislation, and whether it's in the courts, because don't forget, you know, justices and you know, justices, Supreme Court and beyond make decisions not in a vacuum, in a political vacuum. They make decisions, you know, in the reality of what's happening in the country and kind of the zeitgeist. So those are kind of three indicators I would point to.
Okay, another student who's read your book noted the importance of third parties, other governments who will support nonviolent resistance movements elsewhere. Often the conversation is how the US government could support movements in other countries, but this student is kind of flipping it and saying, with regard to protests and police reactions, I would like to ask what foreign countries and governments could do to help America come to terms and help solve this issue around specifically police brutality, racial justice?
Yeah, that's a great question too. You know, one of the things that was most striking for me about the Black Lives Matter protests were how international they were. I mean, seeing all of the different rallies, demonstrations, signs of solidarity coming in from like literally all parts of the world was a pretty remarkable aspect, I think, of that movement. So I think there's a huge role to play in kind of demonstrated solidarity with the kind of most important movements of our times, and making the link between all of these issues, that the issue of racism and white supremacy is not something that's confined to the United States. It's a global problem in many respects, and we have to be kind of working together to resolve it. So I think kind of the global solidarity aspect is really critical. And also, we were talking about this earlier, John, just the importance of learning from other examples. So you were mentioning reparations, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I think there's so much, you know, important learning that can happen by talking with people from different countries who have different lived experiences, like things like, you know, addressing racism, addressing civil conflict, and learning from them kind of what worked. And I would note that actually reparations has been the central theme of the deep canvassing work for the past 3 years, and already seeing the change, and people ask for examples. So part of the training is, you know, giving examples from South Africa, from some other countries around the world, from Guatemala, of what like reparations look like, Germany following World War II. So I think there's a huge kind of opportunity to be just learning from each other and bridging, you know, this kind of artificial divide between domestic politics and international politics. We need to tear down that wall and really be bringing these perspectives and communities together.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of real feature of conversation. So much of the focus is often abroad, and an openness really to these creative experiments, truth commissions, and the like. But to now say that this is a moment to really apply those here, it seems to be a very exciting part of these conversations. We're talking a little bit about kind of education, and another student asks, you know, one of the issues I found myself struggling with is that throughout my educational career, there's not a major emphasis on the successes of nonviolent demonstrations and practices throughout history. I often learn more about war and its positive contributions to society. Do you think it's possible in the future for schools to place more of an emphasis on the history of nonviolent success in education, especially early education like middle school? If so, how can we make this change?
Yeah, that's really an important question. I think it's so true. And so think about how you all study the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War period. It's like how, you know, the colonies obtained independence from the British monarchy. You study one war after the other, and Boston Massacre and all this, when in reality, the vast majority of activities during that time, from no taxation without representation, to the, you know, boycotting the payment of taxes on salt, to the establishment of parallel structures and institutions, to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which in my view was one of the most powerful acts of civil disobedience in the history of the world. All of this de facto separated the colonies from the British monarchy before the first shot was fired. And so, but yet when we study that period, it's all about kind of, you know, the violence and the battle. So I think studying our history, you know, from anti-slavery abolition to, you know, suffrage, civil rights, and all like the causes that have transformed our country and are as American as apple pie, frankly, need to be integrated more into curricula. And starting, as the questioner rightly noted, starting at a young kind of primary level, when people are just starting to absorb the heroes and what matters and what is powerful. Imagine if, you know, young kids get to high school thinking, well, wait, power doesn't flow from the barrel of a gun. Power is actually grounded in what we do, and we have the power, and we have the power to change things without violence. So I think, yeah, it can make a remarkable difference, and that's applicable in the US and also around the world, helping to surface the stories of nonviolent resistance all around the world, whether Africa, Latin America, like lifting up those stories and amplifying them and reminding people of this part of their history is, I think, just really important in the US and around the world.
Yeah, one thing, many things I find inspiring in what you share is the emphasis on power. For some of our students, they may think of power as synonymous with violence. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important to distinguish power from violence?
Sure. I mean, on this idea, I take a lot of inspiration from one of my favorite philosophers, Hannah Arendt, who wrote a classic. Well, she wrote many things, but one was on violence, and she also wrote on totalitarianism. And Hannah Arendt made the clear distinction between violence and power. And whereas violence is essentially how you cause the other to cry uncle, and how you coerce them to doing something. What that shows when you rely on coercion and force is that you don't have that much power to begin with. Like people don't want to join you. They don't support you. So you have to use violence and coercion to get them to do what you want to do. Power, on the other hand, has to do with, bringing people on board and involving them. And it's about them wanting to participate in the change. It doesn't require you doing something harmful to them. So I think it's really important to distinguish kind of between violence and power, and also just reflecting on what is the source of power. Power is ultimately grounded in, legitimacy and how people perceive things, and in their labor, and in their buying power, and in their provision of skills and knowledge and expertise. Like, this is the source of power, and power is fluid. And that's a really, really important concept in the civil resistance world, is that there's no such thing as monolithic power kind of flowing from the top to the bottom. In fact, it's fluid, can shift in different directions, which is where kind of non-cooperation ultimately is so powerful in so many movements.
Thank you for that. Got another comment from a viewer. Big thanks, especially for letting us in on the serious research on these issues. What further research do you think is needed in the future, the near future? Do you know yet how this research might be affected by whether Trump or Biden is elected?
Yeah, very, very good question. Well, there's always more research that needs to be done on this field, which is frankly still quite nascent, the field of nonviolent action and civil resistance. So I think there's a lot more work that can be done. I think one really key area, and it's something that my colleagues at the U.S. Institute of Peace have been really focusing on, is how we can better understand the relationship between nonviolent action and peace building. Like, how can we better kind of understand what works, why, and how in combining kind of nonviolent direct action, protests, strikes, boycotts, to the use of dialogue, negotiation, mediation. There are general understandings right now, but I think we need to understand those processes a lot better. So for example, what happens during transition processes? So in Sudan, for example, mass popular uprising last year against the dictator Omar Bashir. How do we understand the relationship between the mass protests that were happening and the very sensitive dialogue and mediation that was happening between the regime, the military, and the protesters? Like, what does that look like? And what can we learn from those dynamics? I think 100 doctoral dissertations and BA theses can be written, just on that topic alone. I also think another really interesting area of research is comparing violent extremism to nonviolent resistance. So like, what motivates people to join violent extremist groups, whether it's far-right groups in the US or whether it's ISIS, and what can we learn about those motivations and recruitment kind of tactics compared to why people join nonviolent resistance movements? And is there something that we could learn that could potentially incentivize fighting with different means for those who join kind of far-right groups? So those are already two areas, but like I could go on and list a number.
Another question building on this, similar to the question about violence versus power, what do you think about recent arguments that certain kinds of speech, racist, sexism, homophobic, are violent? Do you think speech can be a form of violence? Whatever your answer, what are the implications for dialogue and nonviolent resistance?
Yeah, so I know a number of you are peace and justice studies students, and you study conflict resolution and conflict transformation. And I think, there's a lot in the literature about structural violence and how kind of certain institutional, and legal means can lead to violence and cause, a lot of harm in communities, especially amongst vulnerable communities. So my sense of that is, for example, in writing the book, Why Civil Resistance Works, we needed to define violent and nonviolent. And when you're a researcher trying to compare apples to apples, you need a standard definition of violence, just so that you can compare things. So our definition very much focuses on that which directly harms another human being. So that's how we defined violence in the book, and that's how we compared. So for example, in the book, we don't code property destruction as violence, for example. Other people would, and other coders kind of would. I think that, you know, a racist, sexist, homophobic hate speech are forms of injustice, and they can lead to direct violence. So you can say that they are structurally forms of violence that can lead to direct violence of harm targeting people. So I think there's absolutely a relationship between those things, and they need to be understood kind of together. I think, you know, the implications for dialogue, nonviolent resistance, one is that, you know, we need to figure out ways to counter hate speech. And there's a lot of work that's done on this topic internationally. So Peace Tech Lab, for example, some of you may have heard of that, has been focusing on how to address and target hate speech in South Sudan using a variety of means. There's a growing kind of peace tech, you know, sector in the United States. And I think all the work to counter disinformation, hate speech online, which now it's like living online for the most part, is super important. And yes, and being able to dialogue and talk about, well, how do people who are the victims of hate speech, racist, sexist, homophobic, like, how do they feel? How does that affect their lived experiences? And being able to explain that, and why symbols matter, and why words matter, and why terms matter. And I think all of that can be part of, you know, dialogue initiatives, whether in campuses or on communities. And it's necessary. You need those kind of dialogues to improve understanding. And at the same time, as you know, I've been trying to argue this morning, you also need to be able to confront it directly with resistance and through nonviolent collective action.
Great. And then just a further comment, just continuing the conversation, doesn't destruction of property often lead to direct violence? I agree that hate speech or speech can be violent, but violence against property has similar impacts. Maybe just sharing a little bit more about the property issue.
Yeah, no, it's a good one, and it's definitely come up a lot in the context of recent protests. So I think the thing with property damage and kind of vandalism is that there is a history in the study of civil resistance of targeted property destruction. So for example, the targeting of nuclear sites, where there was some kind of an attempt to, Daniel Berrigan, I'm thinking some of you may have read some of his work in the Catholic social justice readings, where you kind of break over, you know, break into the place where the nuclear installations are, leave some damage, a note and the like. So there are instances of this type of property destruction and the like. And one could argue that it can be effective when people understand it, what the purpose of it is, and when it's linked very clearly to kind of goals and motivations, and people understand. The problem, though, is that most property destruction is not like that. Most property destruction is spontaneous. It's somewhat opportunistic, and people see it as chaos. And you don't want people to regard your actions and your tactics as chaotic. People don't want to join something that they think is chaotic and not going to lead anywhere. And that's sometimes the risk of kind of, you know, the use of property destruction doesn't rise to the level of police violence targeting protesters and the history of state-sponsored violence in the United States. No, absolutely not. And there should not be an equivalency between, you know, property destruction, vandalism, and police brutality and white supremacy. They don't compare. But just speaking about it from a strategic perspective, and from the perspective of you wanting people to join actively in your movement, there can be serious downsides to, you know, engaging in property destruction, which, as the questioner noted, can escalate very quickly. So once certain forms of action become permissible, anything can become permissible after that. And it's very easy to kind of go down the slippery slope of, well, self-defense becoming offensive action. You move from self-defense kind of to protect people to, you know, proactively using violence against the opponent. It's very easy to see this kind of slippery slope play out. So again, I don't come at it from a moralistic perspective. I'm thinking about it from a very strategic perspective. How do you maintain maximum participation, make the opponent's use of violence backfire, and maximize pressure coming from your side. And I think that's where the strategic logic of nonviolent discipline is especially important.
Thank you. Just have time for one or two more questions here. I have one student asking a question that probably on a lot of people's minds, just if, as this person says, having read Why Civil Resistance Works, you argue that nonviolent resistance is more effective than violent resistance. This student didn't seem to notice that you're condemning violence outright. So maybe, is that accurate? In your opinion, can violent insurrection ever be just? Are there ever institutions where you, instances where you'd consider it?
Yeah, no, to be very, very clear, I think I can speak for Erica as well. We don't come at this study from a kind of a moralistic point of view. I have nothing against, pacifists and those who are opposed to violence in any context. I think there's a huge power to that and frankly effectiveness. But we came at this study as researchers and as political scientists, and in kind of systematically comparing, the instances of mass violent and mass nonviolent uprisings. And so we tried to be as kind of objective and come at it from a researcher point of view as possible. One thing I didn't say in mentioning the study with Erica is that when we began the research and the collection of data, Erica Chenoweth fundamentally believed that the violent resistance would be more effective by a huge margin. So for her, it was less of a surprise for me, to be honest, but for her, it was quite shocking that the nonviolent resistance was more effective. So, in the question about, is it ever justified or is it morally legitimate? I could say in many cases, violence is justified. I could make that argument. And I know that if you are a persecuted, oppressed people, you can easily make the case that violence is justified in self-defense or whatever reason. But the question for me, though, is not whether it's justified, it's whether it's effective, and whether it's going to allow you to achieve your goals. And that's where I think the research and the data very strongly point in the direction of nonviolent discipline being simply more strategically effective than using violence. So again, not about what's justified, it's what's strategic.
Great. And our last question here is from a student really looking for strategies to embody, and you ended your talk on a number of recommendations. This student asks, with your experience in creating and studying peace, how can the younger generation make the concrete steps to create a society that is peace-oriented and not spread a larger divide like we see in our communities today? I think you alluded to some of this at the end, but maybe in closing, just again, an appeal here for what the younger generation can do. And we'll close this with this one.
Yeah, no, I love that question. I think it's just so much about following your passions and what you care about and believing fundamentally that you can make a difference, because, it's Dorothy Day who said that, the major changes around the world have always started with a handful of people and then kind of grown from there. So I think I would say, believe in your agency, believe that you have the power to make change. Know that, we have all the tools at our disposal at this point, and there's so much learning that's happening in the US and around the world about what works, what doesn't work, what can we learn strategically and tactically. So absorb, some of those lessons and findings like a sponge, and, take action. Because the thing is, you're not going to, oftentimes you start something, you want to develop a campaign, for example, to increase worker wages. You're not going to get it right at first, but you do it. And you learn from your mistakes, and you keep at it. And so I think there's, just something to be said for being curious, open-minded, being willing to take risks, and believing that you do have the power to bring about change.
Dr. Stephan, again, on behalf of all of us at Loyola and everyone listening, thank you so much, not just for what you've shared today, but really your model as a scholar and someone who's been deeply immersed in this activity, someone who's served our country, even abroad, building nonviolent action there. It is a true inspiration in every sense of the word. And I know also for my students, your example with this book and your passion to chase your ideas and to fulfill the questions that were seeded early and to follow it through is all just tremendously inspiring. So thank you for your example. And again, thank you for your timely challenge at the end around the specific challenges that we have right now that we all need to take very seriously and act upon. So thank you again, Dr. Stephan.
No, thank you, John. It was really a pleasure and an honor for me to be with you and with the Loyola community today. So thank you for all that you're doing.
All right, and thanks to everyone for joining us. One more talk in a few weeks. We'll send out the details for that. Have a great day and best wishes to everyone.
Thanks, John.